Thank you so much. I'd really like to thank Christelle and Martina and, of course, Kunsthal Praha for having me here back once again. I'm really delighted to be here this evening. Can you hear me in the back? It's okay? In 1926, Lucia Moholy moved into one of the purpose-built master's houses at the Dessau Bauhaus. Along with her husband, László Moholy-Nagy, she experienced firsthand what the architectural protagonists of modernism in Germany had long espoused about modern living. Nestled in a pine grove, Walter Gropius and his Bauhaus faculty members lived in this nice, tight-knit community. And it really spurred modern concepts and an extraordinary body of artistic output, including Lucia Moholy's meticulous photography of the houses, their architectural elements, and the modern objects and furniture within. These actively lived-in spaces became show houses not only for how modernism could be produced, but how modern lives might be led. What I want to explore this evening are the ways in which living in this house, with its revolutionary architecture, impacted Lucia Moholy's own photography, her ways of seeing, and her concurrent close collaborations with László. But I want to look beyond the stark aesthetics of the house's white walls and modern heating and light fixtures to get at the more ephemeral qualities of living in these edifices, among these modern objects of metal and glass, the ever-changing light, the natural environment in which the houses were situated, the riveting shadows. These are the elements that surprised me, an architectural historian who has spent the better part of the last 20 years writing about and teaching this very material. What was it like to be at home at the Bauhaus, and how might this embodied practice produce new creative directions for its dwellers? This is what we will consider together this evening. Just a note about the photos, unless otherwise noted, the black and white vintage images are by Lucia and the modern color images are by me. I think you'll be able to tell the difference between Lucia's photos and me, though, just in case. The protagonists of modernism in Germany long promoted certain ideas about the spaces of modern dwelling and the kind of living and thinking that those spaces might engender. So nestled in this pine grove, Walter Gropius and faculty members of the Bauhaus lived in 7 exemplary specimens of modern architecture. And so the director's house, as many of you will know, was its own standalone house, and then there were 3 double houses along the way. Lucia and László lived right next door to Gropius and could see his house daily. But what's so wonderful about the way in which Gropius does the turn of the houses, there was actually a lot of privacy, and so it was actually, I think, not as close as it would be to live right next door to basically your boss, right? So this architecture really becomes representative not just how modernism could be produced. These were really generative spaces of intense creativity, but also how modern lives could be simultaneously led, provisioned as they were with the most up-to-date appliances and furniture. Delving into granular material detail while also reflecting on the actual experience of dwelling within this iconic modern space, the lived advantages as well as disadvantages can be excavated tonight. We're keenly aware that the aspirations of modernism did not always live up to their designers, which I've written about elsewhere. But my focus tonight is going to be on the Bauhaus masters' houses from the perspective of their original inhabitants and insights gleaned from my own stay there in the summer of 2020, obviously at the height of the pandemic. Technologically up to date and following the global flu pandemic of 1918, boasted excellent ventilation, Bauhaus architecture provided in its day and today an optimal work-from-home situation. Here's the work niche, here on the left, of the Haus am Horn, the show house designed and outfitted by the school in 1923, and Gropius' own living room at the director's house in Dessau, featuring the double desk that he and Issei could work at in tandem, her typewriter, carefully photographed by Lucia Moholy, being, of course, the laptop of its day. And the ventilation system, again, following the flu pandemic, installed above the desk, which would bring in fresh, but also you could warm the air. So really, really modern. I ask, how does the phenomenological experience of modern architecture intersect with its archival and historical record and its own materiality in light of the prevailing period ideologies of the time and in our own present? How did these homes form their subjects and their artistic output? I also want to consider the current day realities of residing inside a UNESCO World Heritage Site. What this residency revealed about the space and my own subjectivity beyond the usual architectural historical methods. An essential part of my interest centers on interiority, that is, the condition of being inside. Especially during the pandemic, it was even more sort of fraught, as it were. And specifically, the sometimes contentious but always ideological spaces of modernism. Interiority is the bounded physical framework and mental state of an inhabitant inside a structure, especially the home, often formed by, or alternatively, a reaction to, if we consider, for instance, the interiors and interiority of Virginia Woolf or Sylvia Plath, the predominant social and cultural life or expectations, especially of women, of a given time period. Interiority is what it means to inhabit a space, to truly inhabit it, in physical body and with its objects, the consumer trappings of a given age, from the cactus gardens of the 1920s here, purpose-built and inserted, to the macrame plant holders of the 1970s. Interiority is also the dwelling in the space of one's own mind. It is what happens when your thinking, your inner life, and your identity and your home space converge. Here was László and Lucia's one-half double house. So you can see Gropius' house here, and there they are right next door. There's the kitchen, bedrooms. You can see Lucia here in the front, so taken from here, with László here up in his atelier. And I'll just quickly go through the house, you're probably all familiar with it, but just so we're all sort of on the same page, as it were. Their house had been bombed in the World War II, along with Gropius's. The rubble has been excavated, so all we have is fragments of their door handles and sinks. And yet there's something really moving about seeing the actual handles and sinks that they used, which are now part of the Dessau Bauhaus archive and the incredible archaeological remnants that they have from the sites. Because Gropius designed 3 identical double houses, I had the good fortune to stay in the almost exact house of Lucia and László, the Georg Mucha house. The artist Jan Tiki stayed next door in the much larger Schlemmer house, and you have the wonderful picture that Lucia took of the 3 Schlemmer children, and he had basically a much larger house. So I was staying here in basically exactly the same copy as Lucia and László, and Jan did his residency from here, and you can see the prints that he made that are in the entry here, the wonderful blueprint from the trees and the wildlife around the houses. Each house, or double house, just take you through the plan, had a generous series of flowing public spaces downstairs. So you entered, so this is mine, or László and Lucia's. You enter here in a really nice entry hall with double doors, so it would have kept the wind, and in the case of me, the summer heat out. And then you had a small downstairs guest room, a small WC, kitchen, pantry, dining room space, and that connects with a door that could open into the living space here, and then plenty of terrace spaces here. So this is on the ground floor. And then here's, again, this quarter turn. So if you're out on the terrace, so if Jan was out on his terrace and I was out on my terrace, we could each be having simultaneous coffee, by ourselves if one wanted to. And so here's Lucia and László's house. The living room, again, connected to the dining room, which you can see with the door open here. And then you would go up a light-filled stair hall, and then you would see the bedrooms upstairs. So they had an additional 1, 2, 3. Here was the main bedroom. And then yet another terrace off this bedroom. And then you had the large atelier where you have the amazing windows that you see there. And here's Lucia's photograph of her staircase. And then modern bathroom for 1926, that is. And here's one of the excavated tubs, which is nice because now they've tiled in the tubs, but you can see it was actually, a footed tub from the period. And then the bedrooms here. And then László's enormous light-filled atelier, and here's where I did work basically in the same position, in basically the same type of furniture as László. And here's that sink there, which you see here. So Lucia's darkroom was converted from the ground floor guest room. So as you come in the ground floor, you have the guest room, but she had converted it to the darkroom. And so here you can see that she's actually painted the walls a dark color. And this is the very space in which she developed her iconic photographs of the Bauhaus buildings, the objects and the portraits of the Bauhaus community, and as well the work on photograms, which were direct impressions of light with László. So this is in the exhibition, and now I just discovered we actually have a photo of her darkroom. I didn't think that we had any images of it. Being a darkroom, people don't usually photograph their darkrooms. By being so intimately entwined with the building, Lucia was actively living in the environment and using its objects while she was simultaneously documenting it via photography. But I would argue that she was doing much, much more than documenting these radical new spaces and domestic goods. By being so intimately entwined in the buildings and the objects of the Bauhaus, she thoroughly understood not only what Gropius and the designers of these modern buildings and objects were trying to achieve, but both materially and socially, but she could transcend the aesthetics to express the underlying aims of the school and the modern movement as a whole through her meticulous work. Like any good portraitist, this skill went beyond the dexterity of the artist and the ability to create a ready likeness of the sitter. The outcome taught the viewer something more, gave them an understanding of the object under scrutiny, and made them see the world differently. This is what Lucia was doing in these years and through these images while actively living within it. And I think that's one thing to really underscore here. So often we do have beautiful pictures of modern buildings, the iconic pictures of the Stuttgart Werkbund with the women with furs and the Mercedes sitting out front. And we have these classic images of modernism, and I think that's what makes Lucia's work so important, because these become the images of the Bauhaus. But what really struck me when I was living in the Bauhaus was she was living in it too, and it's so rare that the photographer is also living our photographer here tonight will not be sleeping here, right? He'll be going someplace else. So she was really there, and to think more about what that might mean for everybody. At the same time, of course, these houses have this representative function for the Bauhaus as an institution, and this is also clear in the images. The director's house, in particular, functioned as an exhibition house, playing a very public role. As Lionel Feiniger wrote his wife in the period, Gropius's house, of course, is miraculous. The furniture and the entire setup are intended as representative. And here is a photo by Lucia that she took from her own house's balcony, right? She would have been able to see directly from this. In the film from 1928, Neues Wohnen, New Living, showcasing the director's house, we see it as it was lived in. Ise Gropius was depicted as the manager of the interior domain. Her famous husband, the designer of most of the house's features, is entirely absent from this film. Underscoring Ise's managerial role, a uniformed domestic servant, actually one of our friends, is shown at work operating a number of the house's modern machines and accoutrements. The house boasted an appliance-filled kitchen with labor-saving conveniences, such as an automatic, which you can see here, an automatic soap-infused sprayer for the dishes, right? The soap would be inserted in that, and then sort of was a sort of soapy spray, an early clothes washer, and a centrifuge dryer. She's seen washing dishes and putting them away in the convenient pass-through sliding door cupboards between the kitchen and the dining room. Meanwhile, Issei Gropius in the film is shown drinking tea with friends in the in the living room's tea corner, serviced by hot and cold running water directly over electrical outlets. Don't try this at home. And it also has an electric tea kettle here. It really aptly illustrates both the showcasing of the Bauhaus's utterly modern objects and illustrates the bourgeois tastes and habits that merged with these ideas of technology and convenience. The dining room featured Bauhaus furniture and costly nickel-plated tubular steel, right? It's not just normal tubular steel. Of course, the story of Marcel Breuer looks down at his bicycle and realizes, right, that he can use tubular steel in furniture is, of course, a story, and it could well be true, but it was also nickel-plated originally, and then later other metals were being used. But you can see also here in the dining room, in Gropius's dining room, there was also a plate warmer and other electrical appliances that could actually be plugged in. There's a plug and outlet right directly into the floor in the center of the room, adjacent to the table, so you could also toast your toast right at the table. The bathroom gleamed with glass-lined walls and nickel-plated hardware as well. Contemporary theorist Ernst Bloch, wary of the technological coldness of modern architecture, argued that the bathroom was the real objective of the machine, lamenting that it was the, quote, most indisputable and original accomplishment of our time. And that's saying a lot, right? He writes, just as Gothic cathedrals represented the structure of their epoch, now lavatoriality, he writes, dominates. Somehow, water runs from every wall, and even the most expensive products of our age's industrial diligence now partake in the wizardry of modern sanitation, the a priori of the finished industrial product, end quote. He really condemns modern design as cool and deceptive, right? It has a sort of taint of something exactly not right. And he says that nothing is being expressed except emptiness itself. A deceptive emptiness, he writes, quote, so nickel-plated that it gleams and captivates. It distracts with shining veneer, he writes. Bloch sees some possible redemption in modern architecture and the landscape. However, architecture, he argued, appears as surface, something eternally functional. To be sure, this abstractness connects superbly with glass. The utopia of the glass building needs shapes that deceive transparency, Bloch argues, in words that recall also Walter Benjamin's. It needs configurations that retain the human being as a question. So these are really fraught spaces, right, in the time. They weren't just a form of estrangement to some people, right, who didn't appreciate the aesthetics of it, or the way in which it was made, and the way in which, something like a marble sink is, of course, a very expensive object. And when Gropius publishes this bathroom in his book on the Bauhaus, he actually has them redact out the marble veining, so it just looks like a porcelain sink. Bloch asks us to consider the inhabitant, opening the possibility for a far richer self-determined interiority. These technical accoutrements were intended to make the interiors more habitable to the modernists who dwelled within, smoothing the friction of modern life. That modern architecture was essentially about a manner of living initiated by its inhabitants, one of self-determination, was promoted by enthusiasts of modern design and modern architects alike. The aim of interiors, according to Gropius, was to allow maximum freedom within. As he formulated it, quote, smooth and sensible functioning of daily life is not an end in itself. It merely constitutes the condition for achieving a maximum of personal freedom and independence. Hence, the standardization of the practical processes of life does not mean new enslavement and mechanization of the individual, but rather frees us from the unnecessary ballast in order to let it develop all the more richly and unencumbered, end quote. As critic Paul Westheim noted in the 1927 about Mies's interior plans, quote, the character of a single room does not come from the manner of its outfitting and furniture, but rather from its determination through being lived in. Westheim rejected the idea that there might be a particular way to live in a modern interior, or that interior itself might dictate behavior, as other critics proclaimed, arguing, in fact, on the dweller's autonomy. Period conceptions and concerns about the role of the autonomous individual in society and the relationship of the dweller to these new modes of dwelling and new spatial types. After all, they were radically new spaces. I mean, they look fresh even to us today, right? They're really reflected in the criticism of modern architecture in the time, especially these interiors and their contents. Or, for example, the Tugendhat House faced scrutiny in a series of articles and famous, of course, many of you will know them, subsequent responses to the journal Die Form, where critics and defenders of the house weighed in on whether the house was in fact even habitable. Critics charged that the house was ostentatious, rarefied, that it in fact suppressed its dwellers. Justice Beer launched the controversy in his infamous article, Can One Live in the Tugendhat House? And indicted it for preciousness, excessive display, and pretentiousness, which he felt would force the inhabitants into a life of ostentation from which they would rebel internally. In response, the woman of the house, Greta Tugendhat, asserted that she had never thought that the spaces were precious, or that in fact she found them to be austere and grand, not in a way that oppresses, but in one that liberates. Defender Walter Rietzler pointed out that the Tugendhat was not meant to restrict life in any way, but rather expanded, quote, the sense of what one could be. Overall, the family was in fact freed of the weight of history, of family heirlooms, of precious objects on every shelf, requiring attention and care and cleaning, right? By paring down to specific materials, furniture, and objects, the family members were granted a new degree of personal autonomy within the space. Their private life was represented by their interactions with each other and the activities that took place within these spaces, not their familiar material goods, by their actions, not their possessions. Greta Tugendhat specifically addressed the issue of individuality with regard to architecture, giving credence to the idea that it facilitated the autonomy of the individual. And in 1928, Mies wrote of building a new order that, quote, permits free play for the unfolding of life, end quote. In modern spaces, then, a rarefied materiality and carefully positioned furniture prevailed, but it was the dweller, through his or her own agency, who completed the space. So what does that mean to us? The possibilities for thought and self-determination in these kinds of new spaces was commented on by others in this period, writing in 1930, for instance. The interior as home has gained a different meaning of living. It is no longer satisfied with merely being a closed room, wrote this critic. The human being of today wants freedom, air, and light. He needs distance for his thoughts and ideas. And I really think that these ideas from the 1930s are really relevant again today, if they haven't always been. The room becomes empty, allows movement, and liberates, in contrast to a time where it was only possible with the utmost dexterity to find one's way through living rooms, darkened by multiple door and window curtains, crowded with knickknacks and furniture of all styles. In the whitewashed, empty room there stands today the minimum of absolutely necessary furniture, as if one were outside. And so really I want to argue that these modern interiors allowed for this new mode of dwelling, this kind of open-ended framework for living with a high degree of autonomy, resulting in these kind of rich conditions of interiority. And really, the master's houses functioned in the same manner through these generous interior spaces, fenestration, and terraces, really created this realm in which individual dwellers had room that foregrounded their own agency. A particular quality of staying in the Muka house was the emptiness of it, amplified by the reflections and refractions of the glass, shadows cast inwards and outwards. This heightened an awareness of one's surroundings and the phenomenological effect of one's own self, body, and thoughts within the house. Partially, this was due to a concurrent elevated awareness of the natural world, made manifest in the way in which the house was an ever-changing screen in which the ephemerality of nature was projected, the result of diurnal time and shifting weather conditions. And it was really striking when you were staying there in ways in which the shadows entered the house in the morning, and especially with the 100-year-old glass, right? And the shadows from the radiator, but really you can see this mottled effect from this old glass. But also, as one looked out across these balconies, these white screens were continuously changing, at least on these sunny summer days. I don't know what the houses would be like in January. It'd be really interesting to go back and see how they functioned in really different temperatures and times. But Lionel Feiniger wrote to Julia Feiniger on the 4th of August in 1928, quote, "It is almost too beautiful here. Something new is met with every hour of the day according to the position of the sun. The light effects on the terraces and the rooms change in a most interesting way," end quote. This would have had a profound effect on a photographer whose art consists of capturing light, like Lucia. The abstraction of the spaces was enhanced by these shifting abstract forms inscribed upon the walls and the floors. The effect was cinematic. It was also very similar to a full-scale, life-sized photogram. I would often actually startle when entering a room and chancing upon images on my walls. And all the images, I will have to say, are just quick iPhone snapshots. I didn't bring a camera. And I would literally just enter a room and see something like this. None of these are actually composed. The only thing I sometimes did was try to make, the door frames like line up. But the images, the house is creating its own kind of cinematographic screen, and these images just sort of kept appearing. At night, with the interiors illuminated, the sparse modern furnishings behind the windows turned the glass curtain walls of the atelier and the stair hall into movie screens that had an effect of a film paused in mid-frame, right? So you could see in this way, and it was the house becomes a screen then at night as well. Period critic Siegfried Kracauer might as well have been writing about the play of light and shadow at the master's houses. Quote, "Every fixture and every movement conjures up shadow play on the wall, immaterial silhouettes that hover through the air and become mixed with the mirror images of the glass itself. The raising of this impalpable, glassy ghost, which transforms itself like a kaleidoscope or light reflex, signifies that the new dwelling is not the last solution," end quote. And this was an important subject for artistic study in the period. Lionel Feiniger's photography, a quiet practice he developed in his Dessau years, is also influenced by the pine trees with their strong shadows. His night work is especially evocative, but staying in the master's houses, I found it especially transcendent, yet potently, really experientially, really material. And Megan Forbes writes really beautifully about the way in which she felt that the pine trees were almost like prison bars entrapping Lucia in this period. And Lucia did feel kind of hemmed in Dessau. But there's another way in which the pine trees just create this kind of rhythm and this form of shadows and are really part of the living experience there. By the sharp light of day, however, the windows mirrored back the pines, while from within they functioned as viewfinders to a gridded outside world of trees and shadows. Marking time with the shadows was an especially potent experience. In the early summer mornings, the shadows moved across the wall as if one was dwelling inside a full-scale, long-exposure photograph. Entering the windows, it cast shapes that slowly crept up or down the walls. Outside, time tracked along in the shortening or lengthening of the shadows of the pine trees along the swept ground and up the neighboring walls. So you could sit and have, for instance, a coffee, but more in the evening, a beer, and literally just be watching as the pine trees crept along the grass and up the walls. Elements from the house, railings, cantilever, balcony slabs, simultaneously became abstractions of it, as did nature itself. The effect was watching a photogram emerge from a photographic bath. Indeed, the embodied experience of the artists living in the houses had consequences for the modernism they were producing at the same time, I would argue, giving rise to new forms of it. The whole house itself becomes a kind of light space modulator, which Moholy-Nagy was developing in the years he was residing there, along with Lucia. And with its play of light against the exterior white walls and terraces, but also the walls within. Arguably, his best photograms, produced with Lucia, also emerged during this time. And it's really interesting in the film upstairs, Lucia says really specifically, when asked by Angela Thomas about what was important about the light space modulator as a machine for Moholy, she says, "Oh, the machine's not important at all." I'm paraphrasing. It's the way it played on the walls around it. Indeed, in these years, Lucia worked in close collaboration with László side by side in the Bauhaus master's house darkroom on the groundbreaking photograms, a collaboration best visually and intellectually summarized by their double portrait photogram. In what ways did the house itself also contribute to their fruitful experiments? That's an open-ended question for me. Surprising to me was the way in which the house really breathed life, not cold, hard modernism as one might expect. Despite the emptiness and expansiveness of the interior, the house proved less a shell than a truly permissive membrane to the outdoors, a rich sensorium among the pines. Doors and windows could be completely flung open as the covered terraces provided protection from the elements, and the tilted windows allowed not a drop of rain in. And in fact, there was massive thunderstorms and rainstorms, and the house functions absolutely perfectly. The sheer multitude of portals lure one into the realm of the outside world. It's not as if you have to go downstairs and through, the door and put on your shoes, right? Out of every room are these incredible balconies. And so really the weather was really amplified by the house itself. One could experience it and the weather at exceptionally close but protected range. Visually, the rain slanted across the up-tilted windows. Orally, a summer storm cracked close at hand, the wafting scents, fresh rain on the pine needles. Lionel Feininger, too, would report to Julia, "I'm sitting on the terrace, which is a simply enchanting place. The projection overhead and the short wall at the south, which we objected to so vigorously when we saw the blueprints, are the absolutely right thing in reality. The light would be too blinding, the sun in midday heat too strong without them." End quote. Sounds, too, were heightened. The clarion knock of the woodpecker midway up a pine, which I really am sad that I did not record. Noise traveling between the walls of the houses, the thud of the neighboring atelier metal windows being closed late at night. Some of you might know that Jan is a night owl. The clapping of wood as the double windows were brought together. In the 1920s, each house had a garden area, which added color and scent to the vibrant natural surroundings. While Issei and Walter Gropius limited their horticulture to the covered terrace of their house and basically to cacti, leaving the house nestled in the pines unlandscaped, other Bauhaus members gardened their surroundings. As Nina Kandinsky reported, "We planted lilac trees there and tried to grow roses, which to our delight flourished magnificently." And Wassily Kandinsky noted, "It is wonderful here. We live in the country, far from the city. Hear chickens, birds, dogs, smell hay, linden trees bloom, forest fumes." The sheltering pines surrounding the houses especially contributed to the formation of this immersive scape. The extended experience of the pines was one of the most surprising and deeply felt elements of living in rather than simply visiting the master's houses. At odd moments, the light was caught by the edges of the curling bark, illuminating it as if on fire, which I don't think I've captured but you get the sense here a little bit. Higher up, the treetops too would snag the sun. The entire time I was there, the pines were softly dropping their needles. There were amply brooms provided for sweeping up by the Stiftung, Bauhaus Stiftung, but I let them accumulate on the terraces because from each step I took, fresh balsam wafted upwards. Lionel Feininger too noted this. Quote, "Again and again, I have to tell you how much I love the location of the houses. The more one gets to know the details, the more one is pleased. The sun-filtered pine woods, the rhythm of the slender upright stems," end quote. And just 2 days later, he felt the urge to further expand on this thought. The trees are a blessing. The eye can look into the green without blinking. And how beautiful the treetops are against the sky, free space all around, and the feeling of open air is in motion, filtered through pine woods, is very wonderful, end quote. Given the importance of the environment of the houses, extensive rules regarding the pine grove were included in the original rental contracts with the city for the Bauhaus, which specified that, quote, "The trees standing on the property may not be cut by the tenant. If the cutting of a tree is necessary, it shall be done by the magistrate at his expense. The wood shall be the property of the municipality of Dessau. Any damage to the trees, especially by driving nails and the like, is prohibited," end quote. And interestingly enough, so Gropius designed and built these houses, but they then rented them from the city, and they were owned by the city itself, which is why there are rules and rental contracts. If the architecture of the master's houses is purposely porous, with the decreased division between inside and outside, it also stymied privacy. Frank Lloyd Wright's houses have a similar effect, but he protected the activities and the privacy of his house's inhabitants with exterior walls, hidden front doors, and deep overhanging roofs. Nina Kandinsky, never one to hold back or mince words, wrote, "Kandinsky and I did not feel particularly happy in Gropius's architecture. There were shortcomings that made for uncomfortable living. For example, Gropius had equipped the hallway with large transparent glass wall that allowed anyone to look into the houses from the street. That bothered Kandinsky, who would have preferred to have had his privacy protected. Without further ado, he whitewashed the inside of the glass wall," end quote. Indeed, the staircase glazing rendered one and one's movements especially visible to all the outside world at all hours, which was an uncomfortable element for me. It was impossible to descend for breakfast without being fully dressed for the day. And Paul Klee's cat apparently regularly intruded upon Nina Kandinsky's privacy. As she remembered, Paul Klee loved cats. In Dessau, his cat always kept lookout out from the studio window. I could observe him very well from my private room. Klee, who had lovingly studied the psyche of his cat, however, thought the cat was watching me. "Nina," he said, "you can't keep a secret. My cat will tell me everything." And so the cat and the houses have this quality. Whilst living in the master's houses, I tended to leave the curtains open, allowing tourists to peek in the windows and visually share the experience of living in the house. My basil and mint plants on the windowsill, my keys on the table, happy to share the experience of living in the house as Gropius and the other masters had. And when I lived there, I tried to live there sort of as much the same as they had in the time period. The large ground floor windows at waist height made it possible for tourists to come right up to the window and point their cameras into the interiors. Sometimes they caught sight of me and explained, "Someone's in there." I work with the architecture, not against it, and attempt to run the house as it would have been run in the period. By mid-morning, I shut the windows to keep the cool in. At night and in the early mornings, I open the entire house again, letting the cool summer air swirl around the interconnected spaces. On a day predicted to be 96 degrees Fahrenheit or something like, 40, something nasty in the 40s, I do lower the wooden shutters, enjoying the relief from the direct sun and the rhythmic slats lining up the shadows of the windows and floors. Just like when the Bauhaus masters lived there, at all hours tourists are looking in one's window, coming up to the doors, if not entering the house itself. If I'm outside on the ground floor terrace and want to top up my coffee, I prevent access by placing a Breuer-Wasserli armchair across the threshold like a gate. So I used to just literally take this chair, right, and just put it across the door, and that kept tourists from coming in. One morning, when I forgot to position the Wasserli chair, I returned from the kitchen to find a pair of German tourists in my living room. Because I'm so startled to suddenly find them there, not having had the coffee, I can only sputter in imperfect German, this house isn't open to the public. You must back out." Unfortunately, the actual word which springs to my mind in the situation and which I insert is "raus." The husband of the couple, without missing a beat, indignantly corrects my German to a more polite framing. "Excuse me, but can you please leave," is how one should say it. He shoots back. This was also the experience of the master house dwellers in the period. As Feininger wrote his wife, "What is going on here is beyond belief and almost beyond endurance. Crowds of idlers amble slowly along Bergkühner Allee from morning to night, goggling at our houses, not to speak of trespassing in our gardens to stare in the windows. Today, Moholy was leading a gang and turned down collars. They stood in front of our house until all were assembled. It was awful to be subjected helplessly to such invasions. I am developing claustrophobia. It is demoralizing." The double houses share a basement, a porosity between them. As Nina Kandinsky explained it, Gropius had placed the laundry room and the drying room in the basement and dispensed the partition walls between the two residential units. The basements today remain connected, which quickly became apparent. On my first morning there was a seamless, endless stream of people giving a cursory knock and then entering, suddenly appearing in my foyer. Security personnel with photocopying to do in my ground floor bedroom, which is now a small office for the Stiftung. The cleaning staff bringing in toilet paper to be stored in the basement. Jan himself, the artist living next door at the Schlemmer house, and a friend suddenly appears in my dining room like an apparition. Yet, Clay's cat aside, because the plans of the house are quarter turned, the privacy between the two attached parts of the double house is more or less maintained. My terraces and balconies were not overlooked by the neighboring house, so one could sit peacefully alone in the pines and in one's thoughts. Glass, metal, and concrete make up the material forms of modern architecture, making the visceral experience of the master's houses one of shifting forms, abstract refractions of fragmented materiality. Now empty except for just enough furniture to make it practical for their artistic residencies, these effects are maintained. The house's original outfitting, however, was thoughtfully and individually selected or custom designed by the original inhabitants to different effect. For example, Feininger would write his wife about their newly installed house, quote, "Our dining room is not too small. Andreas's furniture is so colorful and the warm hues of the wood. It makes the room look handsome and snug." The interiors were, of course, exceptionally well documented by the now iconic period photographs by Lucia and others. But there's also a different type of evidence in the city archives. Large and small details about how the house were lived in became manifest to me by spending time with the rental contracts and associated official paperwork filed by Bauhaus members with the city of Dessau in these large kind of binders, with all really interesting old German handwriting, and then, of course, the really modern, all lowercase Bauhaus paperwork and typewriting. The master's houses were rented directly from the city and managed the same as any other rental property owned by the city. After a bit of back-and-forth correspondence, the city ultimately decided to the rent for the standalone Bauhaus director's house would be 2,500 Reichsmarks per year, and the small maintenance man's apartment that was within it was 450 Reichsmarks. For the larger of the double house, so Jan's house, the rent was 1,650 Reichsmarks a year, and the 1,500 per year for the smaller double house, such as what I lived in. Gropius' bathroom, with its luxuriously, richly marble-veined double sink, modern light fixtures, and hardware, makes a marked appearance in the records of the city of Dessau, which recorded all alterations made by Bauhaus members in their houses. Just as any tenant would need to obtain permission from the landlord to make a substantial change, in the original official ledger books, all permanently installed features were painstakingly Germanly recorded in. Upon making improvements to the property, the tenant might even later convince the landlord to take over and buy the objects from the departing tenants. So too are such arrangements to be found in Dessau and the ledger books, which note that the city took over a number of items from Gropius when he stepped down from his directorship, departing for Berlin. In March 1928, Gropius received 5,000 Reichsmarks from the city for items he'd installed, including the marble double sink, 450 Reichsmarks, 2 nickel-plated wall racks in the bathroom, right? So he sold these back. And the electric washer, this is in his basement, and centrifugal dryer, which of course for 1928 was very modern. Also a steel safe installed in the living room, and the two-door garage. Hannes Meyer, the next director, seemingly made no notable alterations, at least none warranting entry by the city of Dessau ledgers, but he did take on Oskar Schlemmer as a subletter, renting out the glass-walled atelier in a city-approved sublet. Not surprisingly, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, taking up the directorship, did log changes with Dessau. Among the objects he registered, mainly in his living room, nickeled metal curtain rods and curtain sets, 4 black silk drapes with semi-transparent tulle drapes, and rush matting for the floors. Here you can see it installed. In the southeast workroom, he logged in the installation of a Candem nickel-plated lamp and for more silk and tulle curtain sets. Under all 3 directors, presumably the house was very comfortable to live in, aided by the use of this new technology and amenities in fine materials. When I consulted them, it was the city records that unexpectedly revealed to us the location of Lucia Moholy's darkroom, the guest room on the ground floor, not as previously assumed in the basement. It appears that the Moholy-Nages installed the darkroom upon moving in, using their own funds, because they had already disclosed the work to the magistrate of Dessau by October of 1926. The ledger records, quote, darkroom, ventilation window with metal flaps, and 3 red panes, glass panes. And a later undated document that reported the addition of a, quote, acid-proof ceramic basin with tap and installation to the darkroom. In advance of taking over the house upon the couple's departure, Joseph Albers writes the city, quote, I request the repair of the house. I ask to remove the wall that was inserted in the guest room to make a darkroom, as the room in its current form cannot be used as a living space, end quote. We then learn in a letter from Hannes Meyer to the mayor, the wall between the darkroom and the anteroom has to be removed so that the previous state is restored, and so that it is possible to use the room as a guest room again. There is a need to repair the wall that was damaged by the removed sink. Since the room is absolutely unusable for other purposes, presumably except darkrooms, this wall has to be broken down and repairs made to the linoleum floor, removal of electrical contacts, removal of the radiator, plastering and closing of the ventilation hole, total approximately 120 marks, cost repairs. Ultimately, Hannes Meyer has the Bauhaus's own maintenance staff repair the house in time for the Albers to move in. As was commonly allowed by renters in Germany, the inhabitants painted their interior walls, famously so. While Gropius's and the Moholy-Nagy left their interiors predominantly white, the other Bauhaus members tended towards innovative and strong color schemes. Weininger was quite chuffed at how his turned out, noting of the paint, quote, the hall and the staircase are my delight. It is so jolly, the red banister against the blue of the walls. Kandinsky's customization was carefully recorded by Nina Kandinsky, with Wassily deciding a different color for each room. The dining room in black and white, the living room was whitewashed light pink, and a niche lined with gold leaf. The bedroom was painted a sage green, and Kandinsky's study a light yellow, and the studio and guest room a light gray. The walls of the small private room glowed light pink, she writes. This famous gold leaf also makes an appearance in the Dessau ledgers when the city magistrate visited in November of 1926 and documented the houses. The magistrate noted about House Kandinsky, quote, the gilding and silvering of the walls cannot be removed. As such, they are not included as the property of the tenant. In other words, he can't take his gold with him. And so upon departure, Kandinsky is not able to take his gold and silver leaf. In my own stay at the Haus Mucha, there were surprisingly few guidelines considering I was staying at a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The Bauhaus Dessau's house rules were mainly about data protection, parking regulation, and other kind of practicalities. Only an afterword noted, quote, ignorance or carelessness poses a particular threat to this special architecture, the effect of which can be severely disturbed by even small interventions or damage. It is possible that some materials cannot be replaced when they are worn out or destroyed because they are no longer produced. We thank you for your understanding of the special characteristics of this architecture and ask that you treat and use the historic Bauhaus buildings, in particular, with special consideration. We wish you a pleasant and interesting stay in the buildings of the Bauhaus Dessau Foundation. End quote. Likewise, the Bauhaus residency conditions for use, and I had to sign these, right? Only 4 pages long, had few rules. Being Germany, the number one rule was for slippers, right? The houses feature floors that are 90 years old and which are part of UNESCO World Heritage. We would therefore like to ask you to bring your house shoes with you. Soft and inviting, the original floors were in pungent trioline, which you know, when you've smelled trioline, you know that smell. It stays with you forever, right? A cost-effective alternative to the more expensive linoleum made of nitrocellulose fillers and gelatin agents that are applied to the fabric of hemp fiber. Greatly admired in the period, as Lionel Feiniger would report to his wife, quote, the floors in all the rooms are waxed now. Yesterday they did the studio. The dark gray takes on the soft sheen and looks beautiful. On my first day, I find a bicycle provided by the foundation in my residency in the living room, parked on these 90-year-old floors. Famously, only Gropius had a motor car and a garage and a chauffeur, and the double houses shared purpose-built bike sheds outside. But there's no room in ours because the maintenance man keeps all the trash there, so the Bauhaus staff had just rolled it right into the living room. I continue upstairs into the primary colored built-in cupboards. I want to unpack my Bauhaus appropriate black clothing. One doesn't want to clash with the architecture. About the modern interior, Walter Benjamin raised a series of socially contingent concerns related to what he called adjustable, moving glass covered dwellings with rooms in which dwellers could leave no traces. In these interiors, it was almost impossible to form habits and imprint oneself upon the interior, contributing to a particular anomie of modernity, Walter Benjamin argues. As I open the cupboard, the round wooden knob comes off in my hand, and I hurriedly and carefully screw the knob back in, treating it very gingerly for the duration of my stay. Wanting to air out the house, as all Germans value lufting, I attempt to open the window to the bathroom, right? Very important to air out the bathroom, and the metal handle clinks off. I was seemingly imprinting myself on every handle of the house. Objects of daily use gently but insistently repel us, said Walter Benjamin of modernism. We must compensate for their coldness with our warmth if we are not to freeze to death, and handle their spiny forms with infinite dexterity if we are not to bleed to death. Staying in a UNESCO World Heritage house with all the best intentions of a committed modernist with a core belief in preservation pained me at times. But in a sense, these mishaps in a nearly 100-year-old house are no different than the continuous repair and care that my nearly 300-year-old house in England requires. In the spirit of living in the master's houses, out and about on my bicycle, I buy food that might have been eaten in the period. Maultaschen, the German version of a dumpling, and simple seasonal salads and German wine. I conjure the Bauhaus parties with carefully prepared open-faced sandwiches. These are parties of one because it's the middle of the pandemic. In preparation for my stay, I email Lucia Moholy-Nagy, daughter of László Moholy-Nagy, to find out what she might know about their daily lives in Dessau and what they ate. I wanted recipes, right? She writes, there are Bauhaus-era anecdotes about Lucia that she was a vegetarian, non-smoker, and very health-conscious. She replies, my mother told me that when they started living together, my father told her delightedly, oh, you eat everything. From this, I gather that vegetarianism did not particularly appeal to him. We still had lots of Jener glass cooking and servingware in Lakeview in Chicago, which we used every day. End quote. I used the IKEA ware that the residency has provided. In my house Muka, there are 3 bedrooms on the second floor, and the ground floor guest room, now the storage and photocopier room, in the space that would have been Lucia's darkroom. Whereas the larger side next door, there are at least 5 bedrooms over where Jan was staying, over the second and third floors, plus their ground floor guest room. The houses are very expansive, and for this reason, the inhabitants often referred to them actually as villas when fretting about in correspondence about a pay for and furnish them. Mucha had hired Marcel Breuer to paint his bedroom a midnight blue. This would have been a beautiful tone, wonderful tone for the room. Instead, Breuer painted it black, and after the first night, Mucha never slept there again. In the spirit of fully living in the house, I tried to sleep in this totally black room and actually also could not do so. If only I had more neighbors. As Oskar Schlemmer reported of the general conviviality, things are going well in the house. We often play ball on all the terraces, which is very funny and brings a rarely seen life to the colony. Or Feiniger in August 1926 writes, "To be near friends in the other houses, not too close nor too far away. It makes us all feel good. We are in a happy frame of mind." So in conclusion, where does historic house and archive end and the subjective experience of modernism begin? Methodologically, when one stands in front of a modern artwork, absorbing and later writing about it in an academic or museum publication, how much of what one articulates about the work is based on deep art historical knowledge, a keen Morellian eye, long duration looking, and to what extent is it always already subjective? Bloch and Walter Benjamin inquired deeply into the habits, modes of dwelling, and human interactions in a new modern society. Did modernism especially create conditions for autonomy and free will in these kind of resulting interiors? How is our embodied experience useful for understanding the phenomenological side of architecture, especially modernism, given its weighty, theoretical, and ideological frameworks? Is the Bauhaus, which only existed for 14 years, and whatever each of us might think the Bauhaus is or means, it has been cohesive enough to persist. Modernism in architecture more widely is many things to many people by now. Battered and fragmented, contested, disregarded, and rediscovered, and now with the rising star of our postmodernism, perhaps it is in retrograde once again. And yet it too has enough of a contour and a materiality, enough of a cohesive ideology, which has allowed it to persist in its complexity and contradictions. It is thus these moments of fragmentary modernism that I found so compellingly embodied while living in the master's houses, its sharp-edged abstract shadows, and alone in the deep quiet of the Dessau crystalline nights and foggy early mornings, snippets of the lives of the past living in the lives of the present. In the Bauhaus master's houses, I feel I found Lucia Moholy. Thank you.